The night of the change began like every other. David, in his worn-out sneakers and faded uniform, was finishing his shift when he heard the distant echo of orchestral strings playing on the radio of the night watchman. The melody transported him back to his youth, to the mornings he spent practicing for hours, and the afternoons when his grandmother would sit in the sunlight, her eyes closed, soaking in the music he played. She once told him, "David, music isn't just for the stages, it's for the soul." But life hadn't been so kind. After she passed, failure and fear crept in, tearing him away from his passion. Now, as a middle-aged janitor, he lived quietly in the shadow of what could have been. That was before the accident. As David was about to clock out, he noticed something peculiar on the stage. A piece of sheet music left abandoned on the piano. He felt drawn to it, his hands itching to feel the smooth keys. "Why not?" he thought to himself. "No one's here." He sat on the bench, and for the first time in years, let his hands hover above the keys. The opening note was timid, shaky, but then his fingers took over, as though they had been waiting all along. The hall came alive with music, the kind that seeps into the walls and lingers in the air. David didn't notice the night watchman standing at the door, listening, tears forming in his eyes. Word spread. The concert hall manager, hearing about the janitor with the golden hands, insisted David play at the staff holiday gathering. Days of anxiety followed as David wrestled with doubts. Who was he to perform? Isn't this a young man's game? But something had shifted that night at the piano, a spark that refused to be extinguished. Slowly, and against every nagging thought urging him to say no, David began to practice in private. Every note was an argument against fear, every bar a reclamation of the joy he'd buried. By the time the staff gathering arrived, David stood trembling before his colleagues. The room was noisy with chatter until his hands touched the piano. In that moment, a tangible silence descended, and every ear leaned toward the notes pouring out. The melancholy strains of Chopin melted into an improvised crescendo of hope, leaving even the cynics in tears. Yet this wasn't the end. The performance caught the attention of a local event organizer who had attended as a guest. She invited David to play at a community recital, an offer he almost declined, still unsure if his rediscovered gift belonged on a public stage. But his young daughter stopped him, taking his hand and saying, "Daddy, I want everyone to hear the music you play. It feels like magic." With her words entwined in his soul, he agreed. The recital was life-changing. David played not just for the audience, but for the young dreamer he'd once been, and for the man who had thought his story was over. People wept. People stood. People demanded more. Overnight, the janitor was no longer invisible. Each performance became a stepping stone to something greater. Soon, he was invited to play with small orchestras, and later in prestigious halls. But David wasn't motivated by fame. What mattered was the people who approached him after each performance, sharing their stories about giving up on their dreams and seeing in him a reason to reconsider. David's journey reminds us that life's detours don't define us. Our willingness to begin again does. It's never too late to uncover the gift you nearly forgot or the dream you left behind. David dared to trust the call of his soul, not because he was fearless, but because he couldn't ignore it anymore.